light, dim the streets in moonlight bright. We dissect the cinematic art, real by real we pull apart.
Hey there, and welcome back to Real Talk. I'm your host, Josh, and today we're sinking our teeth, pun absolutely intended, into a film that is raw and unflinching as its title. We're talking about the 2016 French film, Raw, a coming-of-age horror movie that'll make you squirm, think, and maybe even look twice at your dinner plate. Now, if you've seen it, you know exactly why we're talking about it today. If you haven't, well, what are you waiting for? Pause this, go watch it, and come right back, because this one is a doozy. Directed by the incredibly talented Julia Ducournau, Raw tells the story of Justine, a shy, vegetarian freshman at veterinary school. She's brilliant, sheltered, and honestly just trying to fit in, like most of us were at 18. But let's just say her journey to self-discovery takes a wild and bloody turn when she's forced to eat raw meat during a hazing ritual. What starts as a small rebellion against her upbringing spirals into something much darker and more primal. What I love about Raw, besides how it clings to your brain long after you've watched it, is how it walks this tightrope between horror and humanity. Sure, it's got its fair share of shock moments that'll make even the seasoned horror fans wince, but underneath all of that, it's a story about identity. It's about figuring out who you are when everything you thought you knew about yourself starts to crumble. And honestly, this isn't your typical coming-of-age film. It's not Breakfast Club or Lady Bird. This is a coming-of-age with teeth, literally and figuratively. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, but it's also beautifully relatable in the way it captures those moments of realizing you're not quite who you thought you were. Or maybe you're more. And because it's directed by Julia Ducournau, a woman who is unafraid to explore taboo topics like hunger, desire, and the female body, Raw brings a perspective to both horror and adolescence that's refreshingly unapologetic. So here's what we're diving into today. We're going to peel back the layers of Raw. We're going to dig into what makes it such a standout of the coming-of-age genre. We're from its bold storytelling to the deeper themes of autonomy and family dynamics, and even its cultural impact. Trust me, this is one conversation you won't want to be missing. All right, enough teasing. Let's jump into the background and context of this cinematic gem. Who is Julia Ducournau, and how did she create something so visceral and unforgettable? Stick around, because we're just getting started. So let's start by talking about the mastermind behind Raw, Julia Ducournau. If you haven't heard her name before, trust me, this is a filmmaker whose work sticks with you. Ducournau grew up in Paris, and you could say storytelling was practically in her DNA. She studied screenwriting at La Famille, which is kind of like the Harvard of film schools in France. Even in her early work, you could see a fascination with transformation, both physical and emotional. And it's not just about characters changing on the surface. It's about what those changes say about who we are inside. Her parents played a pretty big role in shaping her perspective as well. They were both medical professionals, so she grew up with this very clinical understanding of the body. But I think what's interesting is how she blends the scientific lens with a deeply human, poetic approach to storytelling. It's like she's saying, hey, the body is weird and messy, but it's also the most honest thing about us. That mix of clinical and emotional is all over Raw. Every frame is designed to make you feel just a little uncomfortable, but also fascinated. Now, the timing of the film. Raw hit theaters in 2016, during what I like to call the golden age of modern horror. You had films like The Babadook and It Follows, redefining what the genre could be. These weren't just about jump scares. They were stories that got under your skin, dealing with themes of grief, trauma, and isolation. Raw fit right into that wave, but stood out in a big way. Why? Well, because it's unapologetically female. And let's not gloss over how important that is. Yes, I know The Babadook was also female, but this one is a little bit different. As we know, women directors were starting to gain more visibility in the industry, but they still face and continue to face an uphill battle. But Ducournau didn't just step into the spotlight, she kicked the door down with Raw. She wasn't afraid to confront taboos around topics that are often sanitized or ignored, like female appetite, autonomy, and desire. It's raw, pun fully intended, but it's also incredibly nuanced. Another thing that sets her apart is how she uses horror as a lens to explore identity. With Raw, she doesn't just want to shock you, although, trust me, there are moments that will make you squirm. She wanted to start a conversation about what it means to grow up, especially as a young woman in a world that's constantly telling you who you should be. And that's why Raw isn't just a horror movie here. It's also a coming-of-age story. It's about discovering who you are, even when that discovery is messy, painful, or just downright terrifying. And of course, Raw was just the beginning for Ducournau. Fast forward to 2021, and she's winning the Palme d'Or at Cannes for Titane, which is another body-centric masterpiece, or so I've read. I haven't watched it yet. But for me, and for so many fans, Raw is a very special film because it is bold and uncompromising voice of Julia Ducournau really first broke through. Alright, well that's enough behind the scenes stuff. Let's get into the heart of this film, its story and its characters. And trust me, there's a lot to talk about there. Alright, so let's really dig into the story of Raw and its characters. Don't worry, I'm going to steer clear of any major spoilers, but there's still a lot to unpack here. So Raw follows Justine, a young woman who's stepping into a whole new world as she begins veterinary school. Right off the bat, we learn she's a top-tier student, a perfectionist, raised in a strict vegetarian household. But when she arrives at school, she's suddenly thrust into an environment that's chaotic, liberating, and just plain overwhelming. And then there's the hazing ritual. Imagine this. You're a staunch vegetarian, and someone hands you raw rabbit liver and says, "Eat it." That moment, which should just be gross or shocking, actually sets the stage for Justine's entire transformation. Because it's not just about the act of eating meat. That one bite awakens something in her. Something primal, uncontrollable, and honestly, it's terrifying. It's like all the boundaries she's ever had are gone, and she's left trying just to figure out who or what she really is. And then we have Alexia, her older sister. And Alexia is already at the vet school. And at first glance, she seems like the polar opposite of Justine. Where Justine is restrained and rule-abiding, Alexia is wild, unpredictable, and reckless. But as the story unfolds, we realize they're not really that different after all. Their relationship is messy and layered. It's got rivalry, tenderness, resentment, and love all tangled together, just like real sisters. There's this incredible push and pull between them, like they're constantly testing each other's limits. And I think it's fascinating how this film uses the vet school itself as more than a setting. The school is harsh, it's cold, unrelenting, mirroring the pressures that Justine is feeling. It's a place where rules don't matter as much as survival, and that chaos really forces her to confront parts of herself she's never really had to deal with before. And what really makes Raw stand out is that it's not just about the physical transformation Justine goes through. It's about the psychological one. This is a girl who's been sheltered her entire life, and suddenly she's out in the world, dealing with things like peer pressure, new freedoms, and really, let's be honest, a lot of bad decisions. The cravings she starts to feel, the hunger for meat, and eventually for human flesh, become the perfect metaphor for all those messy, overwhelming desires we experience when we're figuring out who we are. And here's where Raw does something really cool. Most horror movies would give us a monster to fight or an external threat to overcome. But in Raw, the monster is Justine herself, or at least it feels that way. The real horror isn't out there, it's inside her. And that's way scarier because it's so relatable. We've all had moments where we're like, why am I feeling this way? Where did this part of me come from? And I think it's refreshing how Julia Ducournau handles all of this through the female lens. Justine's story here is deeply tied to her body, her cravings, her sexuality, and her autonomy. And Ducournau doesn't shy away from that. There's no glossing over the uncomfortable stuff. Instead, she leans into it, and she makes us sit with the discomfort and really think about it. And the characters themselves, well, they feel real, even when things get surreal. Justine isn't your typical final girl or horror protagonist. She's a flawed, vulnerable, and sometimes downright unlikable girl. But I think that makes her more compelling, because you don't always agree with her choices, but you also understand why she's making them. And then there's Alexia. I have to say she might be one of the most complex sibling characters I've seen in a movie. One minute she's cruel and dismissive. The next, she's protective and caring. Their relationship is the emotional core here, and it's really fascinating to watch how it evolves as the story gets darker. What really stuck with me, though, is how the movies subvert so many of the horror genre tropes. Like, you think you know where the story is going. Maybe Justine will turn into a villain, or maybe she'll find a way to cure herself. But no, the film doesn't play by the rules. It's not about labeling people as good or bad. Instead, it's more about embracing the complexity of being human, or in this case, almost human. And I think that's what makes Raw really shine. It doesn't spoon feed us answers or wrap everything up neatly. It leaves room for us to sit with it, to think about what it all means, and maybe even see a bit of ourselves in Justine's journey. Alright, I think I gave you enough to chew on. More puns. Let's shift gears and talk about the deeper themes and symbolism in Raw. Because trust me, this movie is like an onion. It's got some layers. Okay, so let's get into what I think is the beating heart of Raw. That's the themes and symbolism. This is where Ducournau's work goes from being visually stunning to absolutely unforgettable. So Raw is about self-discovery and identity, but it's not the neat, polished version we often see in a coming-of-age film. This is messy, uncomfortable, and frankly, it's primal. Justine's cravings, they're not just about hunger. They're a stand-in for everything that makes us human. The desires we suppress, the instincts we're taught to be ashamed of, and yes, even the destructive tendencies we all have sometimes. I love how the film doesn't judge Justine for this. It's not a cautionary tale. Instead, it's like, hey, this is a part of growing up. It's awkward and it's weird, but it's also necessary. Think about it. The title Raw isn't just about meat. It's about being unfiltered and exposed, stripped down to the authentic version of yourself, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. And then there's the theme of family. I mean, who doesn't have a complicated relationship with their family, right? Justine and Alexia's dynamic is fascinating to me. On the surface, they're your typical siblings. They bicker, they compete, they share inside jokes. But there's this underlying tension that feels so real. They love each other, but they also are rivals in a way. And the secret they share, that takes it to a whole nother level. It's like this literal manifestation of the ties that bind them, whether they want it to or not. Blood in this film is more than just something gory. It's about connection. It's about inheritance. Things passed down to us that we don't understand when we're forced to face them. And then let's talk about the meat, because you got to talk about the meat. It's everywhere in this movie. And it's not just a gross out factor, because it's loaded with symbolism. Meat represents temptation. It represents transformation. It's this thing that's both enticing and repulsive at the same time, which I think mirrors a lot of the experiences of adolescence, don't you? I mean, you're drawn to things, people, experiences, feelings that you don't fully understand, and sometimes those things can be destructive. The veterinary school plays into this as well. It's so sterile and clinical, like a symbol of control and order. But Justine's journey completely disrupts that. Her cravings, her transformation, they're messy and chaotic, the total opposite of what the school environment represents. And now there's a visual element I absolutely have to highlight, and this happens in a lot of horror, especially horror that deals with psychology, and it's the use of mirrors. Mirrors are everywhere in this film. And every time Justine looks at herself, there's a sense of alienation. She's seeing herself, but not quite. It's distorted, or it's fragmented, or it's even completely unfamiliar. And that, to me, perfectly captures what it feels like to grow up and realize you're not who you thought you were. Or maybe you are, but it's a version of yourself you're just meeting for the first time. Another piece of symbolism that I found really compelling was the hazing rituals. On the surface, they're just part of the school's tradition, right? But they're so brutal and dehumanizing. It's like this commentary on how society forces us to conform, to prove ourselves, even at the expense of our own individuality. And for Justine, those rituals are a breaking point. They set her transformation into motion, but they also show us how much pressure she's under just to fit in. And then you can't forget the film's visual language. The colors in Raw are so intentional. The red hues that you see them everywhere, from blood to meat to the way the light hits certain scenes. It's visceral and it's passionate. And it's almost like the film itself is alive. And I think it's really striking how Raw uses the horror elements to amplify its themes rather than overshadow them. The horror isn't there just to shock you. It will, but it's also there to make you think. Why are we so uncomfortable with hunger, with desire, with the idea that we're not entirely in control of ourselves? These kind of questions the film asks linger with you, and long after it's over, you keep thinking about those things. In short, Raw is this brilliant tapestry of themes and symbolism that really works on so many levels. It's visceral and cerebral all at once, and that makes it a standout film. Alright, I think we've marinated on themes just long enough. Let's move on to talk about how this movie was received. and the impact it's had on audiences and filmmakers alike. So how did Raw land with audience and critics? Well, it really made a splash. When Raw premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 2016, it didn't just quietly blend into the lineup, it came out swinging. It won the Fipresci Prize, which is a big deal. That award is all about recognizing films that push boundaries and offer something fresh, and Raw certainly fits that bill. Things get a little wild because reports started circulating that people were fainting during screenings. Actual fainting. Ambulances were apparently called. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of sounds like a PR dream for a horror movie, right? Of course, the fainting wasn't just because of the gore. It was that visceral impact of the story and the visuals, because it literally sometimes gets under your skin. And while that might have scared some folks off, for many, it made Raw a must-watch. Critics couldn't stop talking about how Ducournau managed to balance shocking and grotesque imagery with a story that was so deeply human. It's a rare skill to make you squirm in your seat one moment and reflect on your own identity in the next. And I find it interesting how Raw walked the tightrope of being both deeply unsettling and still artistically stunning. It's not your typical popcorn horror flick. There's no masked killer or haunted house. Instead, the horror comes from something much closer to home. The body, the family, and the things we don't want to admit about ourselves. That blend of intimacy and terror really hits audiences hard. And as we talked about earlier, can't forget the cultural moment that this film arrived in. 2016, we were already seeing this incredible resurgence of the elevated horror. Films like The Babadook and It Follows had started to redefine what horror could be. And Raw came in and said, yeah, but have you considered adding some cannibalism to the mix? And oddly, somehow it worked. Another big part of its impact, it was a major win for women in filmmaking. Julia Ducournau wasn't just another voice in the industry. She became the voice of a new kind of horror. Her success paved the way for other women directors to push boundaries. Look at where she's gone since. As I mentioned, she won the Palme d'Or for Titane. That kind of trajectory is inspiring. The legacy of Raw is still being felt. It's kind of become a bit of a touchstone for discussions about body horror, female identity, and how horror can tell deeply personal stories. This is one of those films that you might not want to watch every year. It is intense, but when you do revisit it, it still hits like the first time. And for the fans who love it, it's become something of a badge of honor. If you're part of the I Survived Raw club, you know exactly what I mean. Raw, and I know I say this a lot, but Raw is a movie that you experience, a movie you think about. And in the world of horror, where so many films can be forgettable, that's a huge accomplishment. Now that we've covered how Raw made its mark on audiences in the industry, let's shift gears and dive into my opinions about what makes this coming-of-age story so hauntingly unique. Stick around. I hope it gets intense. Okay, so real talk here. Let's talk about Raw in the bigger picture, because this is one of those films that I think is going to stick with you, and not just for the graphic moments, but for what it's really saying. On the surface, sure, it's a coming-of-age story wrapped in a horror package, but dig a little deeper, and it's clear this film is about so much more than just cannibalism or shocking imagery. this is about those messy, uncomfortable parts of growing up that we don't want to admit to. Think about it. Adolescence is a time when you're figuring out who you are, and sometimes that process isn't pretty. I know this is a little bit after adolescence, but she's still going through those adolescent themes of finding herself. It's awkward, it's raw, and raw takes the metaphor and runs with it. Straight into territory most films wouldn't dare to go. And that's what makes it such a standout. Something else that really elevates Raw is how personal it feels. It's not just horror for horror's sake, though I enjoy that too, but this one is a deeply emotional story about identity, family, and control, or sometimes the lack of it. You see Justine go from someone who follows the rules, whether it's her strict vegetarianism or her academic excellence, to someone who is completely untethered. The journey is visceral. You feel every misstep, every moment where she loses control, and you kind of root for her to figure it out, even as things continue to get darker. And can we just take a moment to appreciate how the film challenges the usual coming-of-age tropes? So often, these stories focus on self-discovery as this neat, empowering process. But here, self-discovery is terrifying. It's ugly. It's about confronting parts of yourself that you'd rather keep buried. And that's such a refreshing and, let's be honest, brutally honest take on what is really like to grow up. Something else I really loved is how Ducournau uses horror as a tool, not just for scares, but for storytelling. The body horror isn't there to gross you out, although it does do a great job of that. It's there to symbolize Justine's transformation, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Every bite of meat she takes, every moment where her cravings take over, is her breaking free from the constraints of who she was supposed to be. It's horrifying, and it's also liberating in a way that only Raw could pull off. And let's talk about family for a second. That sibling dynamic between Justine and Alexia is so well done. It's messy and complex, just like real siblings. There's love, competition, some betrayal, and that unspoken bond that ties them together, no matter what. Their relationship is such a huge part of what makes us feel human, even as it ventures into the surreal areas that it goes. For me, Raw hits that sweet spot between art and entertainment. It's the kind of movie that makes you squirm, makes you think, and just buries its way into your head. And honestly, isn't that what the best films do? So for me, I'm giving this a 9 out of 10. It's not perfect, but it's darn close. And it's one of those films that I know I'll keep revisiting over the years. So whether you're into horror, coming-of-age stories, or just bold, boundary-pushing cinema, Raw is an absolute must-watch. Because it's not just a film. It really is something you need to experience. And that's going to be a wrap on today's episode of Real Talk. And what a ride Raw has been to revisit. It's one of those films that really digs its claws into you and finds you thinking about it long after it ends. Whether it's the layered storytelling, the incredible performances, or Julia Ducournau's fearless direction, there's so much to unpack. If you haven't seen it yet, trust me, it's an experience. And if you have seen it, well, maybe this is your cue for a rewatch. Now, before I sign off, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining me. It's always a privilege to talk about movies with all of you. and I love hearing your thoughts. Whether you're here for in-depth breakdowns or just for the recommendations, I appreciate you being a part of this journey. So reach out to me on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, at Real Real Talk. Occasionally I show up on X at Real Real Talk Pod for those of you that are interested, or you can just send me an email at therealrealtalk@gmail.com. That's therealrealtalk@gmail.com. Now let's talk about next week's episode real quick. We're going to dive into the 2014 film The Falling, directed by Carol Morley. It's another coming-of-age story that takes a different approach. This one blends mystery, psychological drama, and a bit of the surreal. If you've ever been fascinated by the idea of mass hysteria or unexplained phenomenon, this one is for you. Plus, Florence Pugh gives one of her early standout performances, so you know we'll have a lot to discuss. And hey, if you're enjoying the show, please do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a review, share this episode with your fellow movie buffs. It might seem like a small thing to do, but it really helps the podcast grow and keeps the conversation going. And if you enjoy the darker themes like this episode and you're into the horror, check us out at it's also Real Real Talk Horror, our horror edition that comes out every Tuesday and Friday, just like this one. But all right, my friends, that's it for today. Until next time, keep watching, keep loving, and keep those reels rolling. I'll talk to you next time.
Underneath the silver screen, gleam, talking reels and all their schemes. Dusty scenes and dreams unfold, stories told in shadows bold. Gritty plots and whispers tight, dim the streets and